Emily once had it all: a dream job, an apartment in the heart of Manhattan, and a schedule packed to the brim. But one autumn afternoon, as she stared at her screen filled with hundreds of unread emails, she asked herself, "Is this the happiness I once dreamed of?" A week later, she left the city, carrying only one question, unaware that the answer would come from a nearly spilled cup of coffee on a remote mountaintop. It all started with a phone call that lasted less than a minute. Her aunt, the one she had been so close to as a child, had passed away suddenly. Emily hadn't been prepared. She didn't cry, didn't say a word to anyone at the office. She simply put in for an extended leave, packed a few changes of clothes, and booked the earliest flight to Colorado, the place where she had once spent her childhood summers running wild with her beloved aunt. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Truthfully, she wasn't even sure herself. All she had was a small scrap of paper, with a scribbled note her aunt had once mentioned in an old letter: "If you ever lose your way, find Elijah, the strange mountain keeper I told you about." As a child, Emily had thought it was just a story. But now, in the midst of numbness and confusion, she felt the need to believe in something, anything. After 2 days of driving through the mountains, she stopped in a small town tucked deep in the pine forests. Everyone there knew of Elijah, a man who had once been a successful businessman in Chicago, then had fallen off the map nearly 20 years ago. Now he lived alone on a nearby mountaintop, with no phone, no internet, and came down to town only once a month for coffee and fountain pen ink. They said he was strange, but wise. Some had gone to seek his advice. No one ever shared what he said, only that they came back different. Emily wasn't expecting a miracle. She just hoped for a little quiet in a world that wouldn't stop spinning. In her hand was a hand-drawn map, leading her up a narrow mountain trail. Her footsteps crunched in the season's first snow, the wind whispering past her ears like a secret. In her backpack were only water, a few protein bars, and a blank notebook. And then, after 3 hours of hiking, she found herself in front of a small wooden cabin, blanketed in moss and snow. The door was open. An old man with silver hair was hand-brewing coffee. He turned around and smiled, as if he had known all along she would come. "What are you looking for?" Elijah asked as he poured coffee into an old ceramic mug. The scent drifted into the cold air, comforting in a way that felt almost unreal. Emily was quiet for a few seconds. She wanted to say she was searching for happiness, meaning, peace, but all of it sounded vague, cliché. Finally, she simply said, "I'm not sure. I just know I feel lost." He nodded slowly, as if he'd heard that answer 100 times before. "Then don't rush to find the answer. First, learn to listen to yourself." He said nothing more. Instead, he handed Emily another mug of coffee, this time filled nearly to the brim. "Take a walk around the valley. No need to rush, no need to talk to anyone. But one thing, keep this cup in your hand, and don't spill a single drop." Emily blinked, surprised. "Is this a test?" "No," he said evenly. "Just a different way of seeing." And so she went. The path around the cabin wound through pine forests, along small streams and rocky slopes. The winter sun hung low and golden like honey. Emily didn't see much, her eyes were locked on the rim of the steaming cup. Each step was cautious, so careful her fingers began to go numb from tension. A squirrel darted across the trail, she didn't dare look. A gust of wind picked up, she hunched her shoulders, focused only on keeping the coffee steady. After about an hour, she returned to the cabin. The cup was still full to the top, not a single drop spilled. Elijah took it from her, nodding in quiet approval. Good. Now, what did you see on the way? Emily hesitated. Honestly, not much. I was focused on the cup. You didn't see how the pines had changed color? Didn't hear the stream? Didn't smell the damp wood after this morning's rain? She shook her head. Suddenly, she felt like she'd failed, like a student who missed the most beautiful part of a field trip. But he only smiled. You did well. Keeping the coffee from spilling isn't easy. But if your eyes are always on the cup, are you really living or just surviving? Emily sat down, her heart still beating lightly from the tension. She hadn't expected something as simple as holding a cup of coffee to make her miss the entire world around her. She thought of all the rushed mornings in the office, drinking coffee not for the taste, but just to stay awake enough to answer emails. Tomorrow, Elijah said as he slowly stood up. Try again with the same cup. But this time, don't forget to look up. The next morning, the sun had just risen above the distant mountains, casting a pale golden hue over the snow-covered trees. Emily woke early in the warmth of the cabin, her mind still lingering on yesterday's quiet lesson. The coffee cup was filled again, just as before. Elijah didn't say much, he simply handed it to her and gave a small nod, as if to say, don't forget to look up. This time, Emily stepped out of the cabin with a different feeling. She still held the cup carefully, but allowed herself to lift her gaze. At first, it was just brief glances, a tree branch rustling in the wind, a cluster of wildflowers by the trail, a cloud floating lazily like something out of an oil painting. Then she stopped for longer, inhaled deeply. The scent of pine, damp but comforting, seeped into every cell. She heard birds, not just one kind, but many, each with its own unique voice. She hadn't realized how far she'd walked. The trail led her to a small valley, where a stream wove between moss-covered rocks. Morning light poured through the canopy above, casting magical rays across the water. Emily sat on a stone and raised the coffee to her lips. For the first time in 2 days, she truly tasted it. Bitter, warm, with hints of earth and wood, honest, like the place she was sitting. She smiled to herself. Not the kind of smile that comes from hitting send on a well-timed email or meeting a tight deadline. This was the quiet smile of someone who had just rediscovered something simple and profound, that life is always here, waiting, but we so often forget to see it. When she returned to the cabin, Elijah was sitting at a wooden desk, writing in a worn leather journal. He looked up, his eyes both stern and gentle. So, what did you see today? Emily began to describe it all: the stream, the light, the birdsong. She spoke in detail, down to the shades of the leaves and the subtle shift of the wind. Elijah listened closely, as if every small thing she mentioned mattered. When she finished, he asked, "And the coffee?" Emily looked down. Only a little remained at the bottom. A few drops had spilled along the rim. "I didn't keep it perfect," she admitted, a little embarrassed. He just smiled. "No one ever does. But today, you really lived. And that's a good start." In that moment, Emily didn't need a clear definition of happiness. In her own quiet way, she had begun to understand that the real secret lies in balance. The balance between duty and awareness, between focus and wonder. And perhaps, that was the deepest answer of all. That afternoon, as golden light tilted across the mountainside, Emily sat with Elijah on the cabin porch. The breeze carried the scent of wild grass and damp wood, while the distant murmur of the stream played like a gentle soundtrack to their unhurried silence. She sat quietly for a long time before finally asking, with raw honesty, "So, what's the secret to happiness?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden spoon, simple but beautifully carved, and placed it gently in her palm. In the spoon were a few drops of honey, shimmering in the late afternoon sun. "This time, it's not coffee," he said. "But try it again, like you did this morning. Just walk around the cabin for an hour. Don't spill the honey." Emily laughed, softly, freely. Not the nervous laugh of that first day. She understood now, this wasn't a game. It was another kind of challenge, to carry something delicate while still moving through the world with awareness. She stepped off the porch, the spoon in her hand. But this time, her steps weren't hesitant. She walked slowly, intentionally, but without clinging too tightly to the task. Her senses widened: sounds, scents, light, the feel of her feet pressing gently into the forest floor. Now and then, she paused to admire a patch of wildflowers, never letting the spoon tip too far. A gust of wind blew once, she shielded the honey instinctively, then kept walking. The hour passed in a blink. When she returned to the porch, she handed Elijah the spoon. One small drop clung to the edge, but the honey was still there. "Not perfect," he said with a nod. "But enough. And this time, you saw the world and held on to what mattered. That is balance." Emily sat down beside him, her eyes drifting out toward the valley below. There were no more questions to ask. Because the answer wasn't something to be spoken, it had just been lived. Elijah poured more tea, then spoke slowly. "Many people in your city carry a spoon full of responsibility, work, family, ambition. They grip it tightly, but lose the world around them. Others chase the world and spill everything along the way. The secret isn't choosing one or the other. It's learning to walk, without losing what truly matters." Emily nodded, her heart quietly stirred, not because the words were wise, but because they were true. So true, they made her want to cry. The next morning, Emily packed her things in silence. It was still early, the sun hadn't yet crested the ridge, but she knew it was time to leave the little wooden cabin deep in the forest. There was no grand farewell. Just Elijah, calmly brewing his morning tea, his expression peaceful, his gaze warm, as if he had seen hundreds of people leave before her and knew that everyone must eventually return to their own life. At the door, Emily paused. "I'm still not sure I understand everything," she admitted. Elijah nodded, unsurprised. "You don't have to understand it all. Just remember how you felt yesterday when you kept the honey in the spoon and saw the sunlight on the leaves. That feeling will guide you whenever you lose your way." He stepped inside for a moment, then returned with a small gift. It was the same wooden spoon from the day before. "Take it," he said. "Bring it back with you. But don't let it become just a keepsake. Let it remind you how to live." Emily took it, her hands closing around the handle like she was holding the most important lesson of her life. As she drove away from the valley, the mountain road no longer seemed so uncertain. The sky was gradually turning blue, and within her was a stillness she hadn't known in years, not because all her questions had been answered, but because she no longer feared them. 3 months later, Emily returned to Manhattan. She kept her old job, lived in her same apartment, still attended meetings, replied to emails, and faced relentless deadlines. But something had shifted, not the world, but how she saw it. Each morning, instead of sipping coffee while checking her phone, she spent 5 minutes standing by the window, watching the sunlight reflect off the glass building across the street. On her walk to the office, she noticed a new row of flowers planted along the sidewalk, something she'd never seen before. And whenever her heart felt tangled or her mind overwhelmed, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out the small wooden spoon. One glance, and she'd remember, keep your balance between responsibility and awareness. A colleague once remarked, "You seem different lately. Calmer. Grounded." Emily just smiled. "I've learned how not to spill the honey in my spoon." The other person blinked, confused. But Emily didn't need to explain. Because sometimes, happiness isn't something you find, it's how you live, awake enough not to lose what matters, and open enough not to miss the beauty quietly unfolding all around you.